All right. So we've got lots of folks from all over, including someone who knows my mom. Well, welcome everybody. Again, my name is Ilana Lipsett. I'm a senior program manager at here at Institute for the Future, and I am joining from Oakland, which is Ohlone territory. And we're really excited to have our guest Pupul Bisht on today to talk about participatory futures. Before I introduce Pupul and get the conversation started, I'm going to just spend a couple minutes explaining the mission behind this webinar series and what the Foresight Essentials program at IFTF is doing. So today I'm going to share a little bit of information about how you can learn Foresight with IFTF. We'll have a really exciting conversation with Pupul, who's the founder of the Decolonizing Futures Initiative, as well as many other projects and work, as you'll hear. And then we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A. This webinar is being recorded, and so everyone who registered will get a copy of this within a week. We have a large and growing training portfolio, and I know a lot of you have been in a number of our classes. We have a number of them coming up, so we'd love to see you in any number of courses that we offer. For individuals, we have our Foresight Essentials class, our Design Futures class, which is actually coming up in November, which I will be co-teaching, so hope to see some of you in that, and our newest course, which is our Scenario Building course. We also have a class on Coursera taught by the amazing Jane McGonigal. If you haven't signed up for that, you can check it out. There's two different courses. One is an intro to futures thinking, and the other is specifically for life after COVID. And then for teams, we have custom trainings where we can adapt any of these training programs for your specific team. And then also our newest offering, which is Future Back Accelerators, labs for senior executives to apply foresight to solve custom business challenges. Again, we have a number of upcoming trainings, Design Futures, which is starting next month, IFTF, our Foresight Essentials training at the end of November, and a Fast Futures Foresight for Beginners class in early December. That's a great intro if you haven't had any exposure to Foresight, so join us for that. And then our Scenario Building workshop, which will start in March. We also have a number of free resources for the community, including this webinar series. We have an Ask a Futurist webinar where you can meet our staff and practitioners and ask them questions. And we have our monthly Foresight practitioner meetups for our alumni of our courses, and of course our newsletter, which shares tips and insights and events. So please check out all of this and more on our website, iftf.org. I'm sure everybody is well versed in Zoom by now. So just for the purposes of this webinar, everyone has been muted and your videos are off. When you want to type something into the chat, please make sure you've selected all panelists and attendees so everyone can see your comments. And then when you have specific questions that we'll get to at the end of the webinar with Pupul, please put those in the Q&A so we can make sure we're tracking them. And my amazing colleague Aicha is going to be sharing links, and she's going to be monitoring the chat as well. So thank you, Aicha. Okay, so today I'm very excited to introduce you all to Pupul Bisht, who is a multidisciplinary designer, a futurist, and the winner of the Joseph Jaworski Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Award. She founded the Decolonizing Futures Initiative in 2018, which is a global project that aims to engage marginalized communities in imagining their preferred futures. She's recognized as a thought leader, advocating for culturally inclusive practices in design and futures, and she's been invited to speak at prestigious global conferences around the globe. She hosts panels on the future of storytelling at the NABShow, which is hosted in Las Vegas by the National Association of Broadcasters. And she's also the youngest founding member of Action Foresight's Global Swarm, which is an internationally distributed team of futurists, researchers, and innovators, and I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about that. So just on a personal note, I'm very excited to bring her on. There was an article published about her work in July 2019, so less than a month after I started at IFTF, and I was very new to futures, and so have been really, really influenced by her work. And actually usually start one of my talks with one of her quotes, which is that if we want to change the future and how we act towards the future, we have to change how we talk about the future. And one thing that her work has made clear to me is that it's not just how we talk about the future, but it's who's doing the talking. So I'm really excited to share what she has to say with you all today and talk about participatory futures and approaching participatory futures to bring in lots of different voices. So with that, we'll bring her up.
Hi, Lana, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone for joining. I was just looking at chat. I was trying to see if I know a lot of people, and I actually know quite a few. So thank you, everyone, for making time for this.
Amazing. Well, welcome. So glad to have you on. I wanted to see if you could just start by, it sounds like there are a number of people who are familiar with you and your work, but for those who aren't, if you could just start by sharing your personal journey of how you came to be doing what you're doing and practicing futures work.
Yeah. Okay. What's the Pupul story? Well, okay. It began in India, in New Delhi. So I grew up in New Delhi, which is an extremely multicultural city. And the reason why I'm sort of mentioning that upfront is because now when I, in retrospect, try to join the dots on my life's journey, I think that that experience of growing up in the midst of so much cultural diversity, socio-cultural diversity, actually, I think is what opened my eyes to how beautiful it is that we live in a world where people are so different from us and that there's so much to share and learn from each other. So I really think that that shaped my worldview in a big way. But my futures journey, funnily, I think started in design school. So I was doing undergrad design at National Institute of Design in India. And by the time I graduated from school, I almost right away knew that the kind of aspects of design that I wanted to focus on, as a design practitioner was to really understand design as a tool for change making. And sometimes it's not the thing that creates change, but it can be the thing that catalyzes that change. And I feel like design education mostly around the world actually does not address that sufficiently. So a lot of the designers are not very aware of the fact of how much power there is in, seemingly neutral, innocent ideas that take shape in their sketchbooks, but actually go on to live outside in the real world and start shaping the lives and the futures of the communities that interact with it. So I really got out of design school with almost this hunger and thirst to sort of understand that and grapple with the power of design in that way. So I actually did not know about futures as a field at all, even when I was trying to figure out what to do for my master's. It's more the systems thinking and systems design piece that I was after, because I also wanted to understand how change is made in a complex system and how do we really create that respect for various dynamics that interact with each other, which took me to OCAD University in Toronto, where I pursued my master's in strategic foresight and innovation. And it was during my time at OCAD where I sometimes share this anecdote, but I was given an assignment in class to write about our favorite story set in the future. And I really, as one of the only few South Asians in the room, I really wanted to write about an Indian story set in the future. And long story short, I couldn't find a story that would fit my assignment's brief. And I ended up writing about an English story. But when I shared that experience that, of not being able to find something suitable from India, somebody made a remark that, oh, that's interesting. Is that because Indians don't think about the future? And I feel like that is the exact moment. That's when the seed of decolonizing futures was planted, because of course we think about the future. I don't think there's any culture in the world that does not, right? So it was more about what is it about our frameworks and the way we're the questions that we're asking, the lens through which we're looking at the future, that is leaving out how my culture, and at that time, my assumption was a lot of other cultures may be similar to mine that might be talking about the future, but it's our current vocabulary or our frameworks that are completely not capturing that or are not sufficient to capture that thinking. So that's really where it all began. And for me, storytelling has always been a really, really important thing for me at a personal level, but also as my, in my practice as a creative. And I really wanted to, at that time, I think being a designer, I had a methods bias. So I said, okay, if I want, like you said, if we want to change the future, we want to change the way we talk about it. The way we talk about the future is through stories. So really what we're saying is we need to change the stories that we tell about the future, and not just what the stories are, who they're about, but also who gets to imagine these stories and who gets to tell them. So I said, okay, if I want to do that, then really the processes and methods that I seem to have in my toolkit are not going to be enough. I need to design something that is actually, that emerges from that philosophy and from that worldview, and therefore has the capacity to accommodate those ways of knowing, being, and doing. And my extensive search for storytelling traditions led me to a practice called Kaavad from India. And that is the method that I was inspired by. And I designed a new foresight method that's primarily for community visioning. And that is what lies at the center of the Decolonizing Futures Initiative.
Amazing. It's such an amazing story, and to just, it's so inspiring to hear, the frameworks and tools don't actually exist for what I want to do within this established practice of foresight. And so I'm just going to create my own. And I heard you say on a podcast that futures for all cannot be imagined by a few. And so what you're talking about is really about how to engage everyone in imagining their own futures individually and collectively. So I'm curious, and for those who are joining us, can you define participatory futures, or how would you define it? And then how does it fit into the larger field of foresight?
Yeah, so participatory futures, or if there is an official definition, I don't know if there's an official definition, but technical enough, is really a practice that lies at the intersection of future studies or futures thinking and public engagement. So, and it's done by employing a range of methods, oftentimes very interesting combination of methods that enable us to tap into the power of collective imagination, but also collective intelligence, and really explore the future from that place as a starting point. And oftentimes, participatory futures engagements are also designed then to facilitate an effective translation of these bottom-up insights into decisions or strategies or policies that are being made in the present, but with a view of the future. So that's sort of the field definition of participatory futures. But I think in my work, especially the work that I do with the Kaavad, all of it is done with a desire or a hope or a dream to facilitate futures thinking that is not just participatory, but is also radical and transformative. So like you said, exactly what you said, that futures for all cannot be imagined by a few. I would go as far as saying today that they should not be imagined by a few. So it's not just about can, it's also about should. And so for me, in my practice, that is the central sort of belief of participatory futures. That's where I begin. That's my entry point into doing this work. So I really see it as an approach to decision-making and change-making that is truly embedded, not just in long-term thinking, but long-term thinking that explicitly centers the voices of the communities whose futures we seek to imagine or improve, or communities who are themselves stakeholders or ancestors of the futures that we're working with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I love that notion of being ancestors to the future, and what does that look like? What is the legacy that we want to be left or that we want to leave? Um, so I'd love for us to get a little bit more detailed even into what does that look like? Can you introduce us to your practice and some of the methodologies, and how do you apply it to the work that you're doing? Who are the clients or the communities or the groups that are using this, and what does it look like on the ground?
Yeah. Well, if I first speak about the Decolonizing Futures Initiative, because I feel like my initiative is one thing, but then I also have a foresight practice outside of that, and sometimes they look very different, even though the philosophy or approach is very similar. So, with the Decolonizing Futures Initiative, the sort of methodological background that I spoke about a bit in the beginning, it's really inspired by a storytelling tradition called Kaavad. That tradition itself is perhaps 400 to 500 years old. It originated in rural India, and it was almost, a way of, it was an innovation that particularly came about to facilitate social inclusion. So the story of Kaavad is very interesting. The patron communities of Kaavad are the ones that belong to marginalized castes. And back in the day, hundreds of years ago, it is speculated that they perhaps could not access religious places of worship, and therefore they were not allowed to perform religious pilgrimage because of their marginalized status in the society. So a group of storytellers really came up with the idea, and they said, well, if the temple, you cannot go to the temple, but the temple can always come to you. And nobody should be deprived of enlightenment, and nobody should be deprived of that feeling of belonging. So they created these small wooden boxes, which is in Hindi, it's called Chalta Firta Mandir, which means a walking, talking temple. And they are these portable shrines, so to say, that have beautiful graphic imagery that really retell the story of Indian mythology. But what is really interesting is even in those stories, there are these mini acts of rebellion. So they reimagine those myths and legends to actually show the connection between the patron community and gods and kings, which, if you really think about it, 400 years ago, that's a really radical thing to do with narrative. And as I stumbled upon Kaavad, which is really primarily through the work and research of an Indian animator called Dr. Neena Sabnani, and she's been researching this method for the past decade or so and has done extensive work. And I was reading this and I just couldn't believe this story. And I said, wow, I knew storytelling is a tool for change making, but I never understood that it could do it at that degree. And because the Kaavad compensates for people's ability to perform religious pilgrimage, the narrative or performance structure imitates the 10 steps of Hindu pilgrimage. So I said, well, I'm kind of trying to do something very similar in that I am trying to bring futures to people who seem to not have access to participate in that discourse. So I adapted the 10 steps of pilgrimage to 10 steps of time travel. So, in my workshops, people come together in their communities and we really leave the present moment, but carry its challenges and hopes and dreams and nuances to go build that vision of a preferred future, and then return back with that enlightenment to the present moment and say, okay, now what can we change today, tomorrow, the day after to, move towards this vision of the future. And all of that is sort of balanced on a very strong foundation of these 7 principles that I call the 7 principles of inclusive storytelling. That is how I design those workshops or, those engagements. So that's sort of the method background of the initiative. And in terms of, I have done that work directly with communities. I've done that work in partnership with, local NGOs. or community networks, but also with institutions and national and subnational governments in India. So I think in terms of applicability, it's really very versatile.
Great. And what is it, what is the experience for you as the facilitator, and from the conversations that you've had, what is the experience for the participants in using these principles and doing this time travel, and in being given a chance to imagine and envision a future that perhaps has not been something that's been offered to them before?
Yeah, I think that it is definitely a very transformative experience, not just for the participants, but for me as well. And I feel like every time I do it, it changes my own, perspective on life and the world. But like you said, I think one of the most common pieces has been, and particularly for the groups that I have worked with, oftentimes the first response that I get is that no one's really ever asked them what they want the future to be, or that they did not even think that it matters what they want. So the biggest impact that I think is that shift, from seeing, and this happens in, say, public sector a lot, for example. We have this tendency to see citizens or people really as beneficiaries of decisions and policies and everything that's been designed in a very top down fashion. But I really think people and communities are not just beneficiaries, they're very, very powerful, and we need processes and frameworks and structures, and we need to foster spaces that allow for that power to really shine. So it's not that we're empowering people. People are powerful already. We just need to accept that and make room for it. And when I say we, what I really mean is incumbents. So I think that for me, that's the biggest shift, both, for the people, but oftentimes for the commissioners of that work as well, is to really start seeing that people don't have to be passive spectators of whatever it is that someone else built for, their future. They can be proactive shapers of their individual futures, the futures of their community, and also the future of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and I a lot of the work that I've done, two of the principles that I try to hold close are that people are the experts of their own experience. And
Yes.
so they need to be included in the process. And also because of the history of how things have been structured, like you said, with the power of the incumbents, oftentimes what people need is an invitation and permission to participate. That they have answers, they have opinions, they have solutions, but they haven't been given an invitation, extended an invitation or participation. And it sounds like a lot of what you're doing is that, this explicit permission to participate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So can you give us a couple examples of work that you've done and how you've applied this practice? I know you've mentioned some with municipal governments. I know you've done some other projects that have included that. So I'd love to hear what that has looked like.
Yeah. Okay. So with the Kaavad, one of my favorite experiences was with a community college called Barefoot College in India. It's in Rajasthan. Interestingly, that's where the Kaavad storytelling traditions also from. And it was started by a really inspiring man, Bunkarji. And it's a for the people, by the people college. So the whole thing is envisioned as a rural university, and the curriculum, the pedagogy is co-creatively designed by the rural community that lives around the area where the college was instituted. So as they were making the college, they also wanted to make it in a very sustainable way. So the entire campus is designed in a very unique way, only using local expertise and local materials. And the whole campus is powered by solar energy, which there is plenty of in Rajasthan. It's a desert area. So now that they have sort of pioneered that model, what they've started doing is every year they invite a cohort of women, so mothers and grandmothers from other rural communities all around the world. They get a scholarship and they come to India, to that tiny village, Tilonia, for a residency of 6 months, where these women get trained to become solar engineers and to take back that technology and transform the sustainable futures of their rural communities. So it's a beautiful concept. And I feel so lucky that I was able to work with them while I was piloting the initiative in India. So I worked with a group of women who were towards the tail end of their training. And within a month or so was going to be the time for them to sort of graduate and, you know, go back to their communities. And that's when the real challenge of applying everything that they had learned in those 6 months and actually translating it into a reality to bring, and for some of them, it was about bringing electricity for the first time to their villages. And so when I started working with them, something interesting that, you know, an interesting challenge that they were able to sort of surface was that they were a bit nervous about ways in which they could make sure that all members of their community, you know, could be onboarded with this drive. And I think that, so in most of the work that I do, the question really is, okay, what can storytelling the future unlock in this situation, right? For these people, what is the most impactful way in which we can use these stories? And so for the women I worked with at Barefoot, that is the space that we identified. And so through our workshop, you know, they really got the space to reflect on potential barriers to you know, making that real for their communities, but also, you know, value systems and other, like older, like more traditional cultural narratives that could get in the way of all of that. And through all of it, they built these beautiful visions of the future of you know, solar powered villages. So they were very specific to their communities and their villages, but the common thread in each of those futures was that they were sustainable solar futures. And then the covers that they built during that workshop, as well as the narratives that they came up with, then became tools for them to take back with them and hopefully, you know, tell that story to their community and inspire them to join them in that transformative change-making drive. So that's like one of my favorite examples from Decolonizing Futures Initiative. But
so
other, yeah. And if you'd like me to talk about the other sort of participatory futures work that I do, you know, I don't know how much I can talk about this project right now because it's just about to get released. But during my time as creative lead at the School of International Futures, you know, one of my favorite projects that we worked on this year was looking at the future of data governance, but through the eyes of young change makers in Africa. So we had a cohort of 16, you know, young futurists and innovators from the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners network that we have, which is almost 300 young futurists from around 69 countries. So this one, we really activated the Africa subset of the NGFP network. And 8 of them were from Kenya, 8 of them were from Nigeria. And then we also had a floating cohort with about 5 to 10 futurists from other parts of Africa, the continent. And some of them were also from South Africa, because we really wanted to bring that nuance of, you know, how varied the experience of digital technology can be from not only from country to country, but also regionally between the East, West, and North and South. And we designed a 1-month-long participatory futures engagement with this cohort. And it was really such a beautiful exercise in not only network building, but creating room for these young people who came from very diverse backgrounds, even within their countries, to come together in dialogue and really envision what is a digital future that they want, where each of their communities is not just surviving, but also thriving.
Mm-hmm.
So to sort of design that entire process and have it delivered in a hybrid fashion, because this was in March. So, COVID is still, even now, a very real challenge. So, and we worked directly with collaborators in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, who were our co-creators, and they were the ones who finally, delivered and held and hosted those processes, which is again another thing that I think is really, really important, is that ultimately all of this, there is no one size fits all participatory futures. So for me, I really treat it as a brand new exercise in designing, and I try to, even if I'm using similar methods, I sort of redesign those methods in every single instance. But as was the case in that project, it was also about having creative humility to know what you don't know, or just to acknowledge that there's a lot that you don't know, and really being comfortable to follow the lead of people who have expertise in that context and who should be the people leading those conversations. And so the reason why that project is so special in my heart is ultimately not because of what we designed or what we achieved, but because of the way we were able to conduct that project. And I think a lot of times that nuance of like where power is held when we're doing foresight work is not interrogated sufficiently. But I do think that in order to do participatory futures work that does everything that it claims to do, but also one that, intentionally does not try to, create more unintended harm, we have to get very real about those things.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating, and I can't wait to hear more when it is made public. I'm curious for that one in particular, and especially given the context of what you were saying earlier of a lot of times the tools and the frameworks that we have and use only serve to reinforce existing narratives. And so, what are some of the ways that you conduct outreach? What are the platforms? How are people communicating with each other? How are people, and especially in a hybrid world, how are people participating, and how are you reaching? Who's deciding who's participating? How are you reaching them? How are they communicating? Yeah, what are the ways that that's
Yeah,
unfolding?
so I think there is still a long way to go in figuring it out, because the biggest challenge of a virtual world is that it in and of itself is a barrier to participation. So digital technology, even right now, us being on Zoom, it is a tool that is facilitating more diverse participation, but at the same time, it is a tool that's restricting a lot of people who probably don't have access to not just the tools, but maybe the bandwidth or whatever to to participate. The other thing is language. I'm speaking to you in English right now. There's no real-time translation. I have started really paying attention to language as a tool for actually exclusion in my work. It's very interesting. Sorry, I'm digressing a bit, but I recently was interviewed by an Indian journalist, and it's the first time when the entire interview was in Hindi, which is my mother tongue. And when I do my workshops, to your question of who decides who's participating, so particularly when I do decolonizing futures work, I am very intentional about uh, you know, really questioning all of my tools. And in foresight work, I think jargon is another big thing. So I had to train myself to subtract all of that from my work and really what is the most essential part of what I'm trying to do. And I think to a very big degree, I was successful in doing that, even in my regional, workshops in India, which happened in many different languages, some of which I am not a fluent speaker in. But there was something about that interview setting that I had 3 days ago, which really, it was a very humbling experience, because I don't think I have ever been interviewed where I'm, beginning to end, I'm not talking in English at all. And that's when it really made me realize how big language is a part. So I think that's definitely a big piece of who participates, who is heard, who has the means to bring forth their ideas, etc. In the case of the project that I was talking about, unfortunately, we had to use Zoom. But then, we intentionally designed a really beautiful balance between asynchronous and synchronous participation. And especially when it came to the asynchronous bits, we got quite creative about how that was captured. So some of it happened on like online tools like Miro or whatever, the more nifty ones. But then sometimes it was as simple as a Google document. Sometimes it was even more basic than us sending an image to the participants on WhatsApp and then them, writing it out on paper and maybe taking a photo of it and sending it back. So we really did not draw a boundary around what is an acceptable way of participating versus what is not. Voice notes were a thing. We did video journaling, so many different ways. It was a truly mixed method approach.
Yeah, that's an important way to make sure that people are included, is providing a range of ways that they can participate and what makes them feel most comfortable.
Yeah.
Thanks. So this is the last question that I'm going to ask before we turn to the audience for Q&A. So for folks who, I see some questions coming in. If folks have more questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'll try to get through all of them. So one challenge that we hear often from people, particularly those who have taken our courses, a lot of whom are on this webinar today, and go back to their organizations, is a challenge of how to communicate the value of foresight, either on their team or within their organization to their superiors. And so I'm curious if there are ways that you think the practice of participatory futures might address this challenge, or might help people kind of communicate why foresight is important and why we practice it.
Yeah. So I think the first thing that, because there's only so much I can capture in a 30-second answer, but I would definitely point people towards a report that we worked on for Nesta in 2019 called Our Futures. I think it's one of the first sort of comprehensive practical guides on participatory futures approaches. And so it was, we researched, that was a Global Swarm project. You mentioned Global Swarm in the beginning. And it's particularly written and designed keeping the commissioners of this work in mind. So whether it's public sector leaders or business sector leaders, and it has not just like the overarching concepts and ideas behind this work, but also potential barriers and challenges that we saw when we were conducting. We scanned over 400 examples of participatory futures from around the world. And so that report is really a distillation of all of that research of over 11 months or something. So I would really say that that's a great starting point for anyone. And to sort of back up and answer your question then, so I was honored to be invited to speak at the 76th General Assembly last month. The first day of every year's GA is going to be on the SDGs. And it's something very interesting that the Secretary General has now put forth. And so I'm quoting him, to say that as a civilization living on this planet, we're really at an inflection point. And what I believe is like business as usual is definitely the path to a breakdown. And my assumption and hope is that that's not desirable for anyone. So if we really want a breakthrough, and if we are truly invested in intentionally serious about the kind of transformative, inclusive change that we all talk about, the decision that we have in front of us at this point of inflection is to truly open up the future. That is the path to creating sustainable, inclusive change. So I see that as a big enough reason for anyone to see the value in foresight. Short-term thinking is not going to get us far. It's only continuously creating more compounding challenges for our future generations. So, so thinking long-term is very important, and thinking long-term in a participatory way is important because the future is complex. The world we live in is complex, and just a few of us are never going to be enough in being able to sense how complex that change is. So when we do it together, when we really tap into our collective power to understand that change, and also, brainstorm ideas, test ideas of how we're going to address it, I really think that's when our chances for success are highest. So in a very basic way, I would say that if we're serious about leaving no one behind, then this is a capability that governments and businesses really need to invest in. And it should not be seen as something that will potentially detract from other urgent challenges. I think this is one of the few approaches that gives us an actual, tangible, practical way of complex place-based problem solving. And when, the other benefit of participatory futures is if we really want to socialize bold decisions or bold policies, bold strategies, then it's very important that we are able to create a sense of ownership in the vision of that future amongst, our citizens or stakeholders.
Great, thank you for that. And what an honor that you we're there at the General Assembly. Thank you so much for that answer. I think Megan has a question that I think is a really nice follow-up to what you were just talking about. And this, can go both ways towards the people who are currently in power with decision-making power, and also the communities that we want to engage in these conversations. So Megan's asking, as part of an intentional invitation for participatory futures, is it helpful to show people what their contributions will add to the conversation, and kind of how do you demonstrate the need for their voices and ideas?
100%. Oh my God, she really captured that. And this particularly comes up in, my work with most marginalized communities, because there's a lack of trust for good reason. Historically, there's evidence for their voice to continuously be tokenized, at best, but also ignored otherwise. So, but I think in particular, when it comes to the participation of youth, I think this has become extremely, extremely critical, because the younger generations are just tired of their voices being tokenized. So what they really want to see from anyone putting forth this invitation, or facilitating or hosting this work, is a true commitment. And that commitment comes by tangibly lowering barriers to their participation, but it also comes in showing follow through. People want to see that the ideas and the voices and the challenges and dreams that they're bringing to the table are actually reflected in the decisions that are being made. So yes, I think that's a big one.
Great, thank you. We have a couple very practical questions. So one from Maz and one from Matthew. wanting to know, can you talk a little bit more about the methodologies to bridge the synchronous and asynchronous participation in a co-design event? And then the second question for Maz is, are artifacts created or written documents, and kind of talk a little bit about the output from these physical output.
Yes. So I'm assuming Maz's question is about the Kaavad workshops. And so, yes, artifacts are created. We use a Kaavad, which is really a homage to the actual tradition. So instead of wood, my Kaavards are made up of cardboard or art paper, and they have as many panels as a traditional Kaavad artifact. The only difference is when I carry them into workshops, they are completely blank. And I bring with me a lot of visual material, iconography. My participants are always encouraged and welcome to draw. So a lot of art supplies, but also a lot of participants bring in their own imagery that is relevant to them, their life experiences and the stories that they want to tell. And through the process of the workshop, each group co-creates a new cover. So they illustrate the blank canvas that I bring to them. And that becomes their tool through which they tell the story of the future that they want. So yes, there are artifacts. In fact, that I think is the central piece of the puzzle. And the other question about asynchronous and synchronous. So yeah, I think, like I mentioned, we just took a very, very mixed method approach to think. And okay, so at a very conceptual level, the way I approach my work is, I don't believe in constantly only designing processes that allow you to invite people in or to you. I believe that it is our duty to put in the effort to meet people where they're already at. So therefore, if I talk about hybrid engagements, I think one very critical thing is to really understand, where are people having these conversations already? What are the ways in which people in that community are connecting to each other? In the case of the data governance project, we found that WhatsApp was a big thing. For those countries. But sometimes, if you're working with youth, maybe it's about tapping into some of the new social media channels. And we actually had some of the artifacts of that process at the end of it, as a way to sort of invite a broader participation. We did two very interesting things. One was, the whole process was 4-stage long, but then towards the end, in the second last stage, we actually made additional funding available for volunteers from the participant cohort to shift from being participants to being facilitators. So they designed their own participatory futures workshops, with additional funding. And then they conducted those workshops. We had a 1-week break. They conducted those workshops in their communities face to face. So a lot of the people who could not be part of our process due to various resource constraints, their voices still got reflected in the process. And then towards the end, they created artifacts of the future, and we encouraged them to actually take photographs, make videos of those ideas around the artifacts, and share them with their social networks online. Some of them did that through TikTok. Somebody chose to do that through Instagram. And that created another opportunity for dialogue between them and their peers who had nothing to do with this project. So I think you just have to get very, very creative about what you have at your disposal and how to use that better.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, so many different ways for engagement and sharing, and ways to get really creative about the platforms that already exist, that people are familiar with, so you really can meet them where they are. And the method of participation, or the platform for participation, isn't the barrier, and kind of allows people to join in a way that feels comfortable.
Yeah.
Great. So, okay, we have a question from Martine. How does Decolonizing Futures connect or acknowledge DPost, and anti-colonial thinking?
Wow, we need like several hours to unpack that. But I would say that, my research, because of my own background, actually started in this space of post-colonialism. So it was, Bhaba's literature and Gayatri Spivak Chakravarti. That's where I sort of started unpacking those ideas. But to be very honest, uh, you know, all of those things are extremely nuanced and very, very different. And the way that I approach it in my work is that there was no one common experience. There is no one common experience of colonization in our world. It is a common thread in the global history, but every geography, every community's experience of it is very different. Therefore, there is, or I would say, therefore, it's very challenging or almost futile to arrive, I think, at a common definition of, what the verb of decolonizing is. So for me, it therefore makes it very, very important to sort of acknowledge the limits of my own experience and the perspective from which I am coming. And this was very tricky because my research started in Canada, and decolonization in Canada, I am not the person who can lead that conversation in that context. And for me to acknowledge that my work or my exploration was rooted but the starting point was definitely a post-colonial exploration, because that's, I come from India, and that's what's relevant from my perspective, becomes very interesting. But if you really look at colonization, and I say this sometimes often, is that I think that a prerequisite for the dominance that colonization is about is to basically undo systems of local self-organization and create dependency. Dependence is a precursor to dominance, and that is what colonization was all about. So for me, I see decolonizing futures as a way of reconstructing, reimagining, challenging, and re-articulating structures of freedom and independence for each community. So for them to be able to, be autonomous, and for them to be able to, self-actualize. To me, that's at the core of the way I approach decolonizing futures. But it's probably a very tiny drop in the ocean of very important, very powerful work that's being done by scholars and practitioners and activists all around the world from different communities.
Yeah. Thank you. And Martine is saying thank you. Really appreciates the detail of your answer. So I think we have time for one more question. And Sarah says, so much of what you've shared is helpful and relevant for thinking about low-income, rural, and Latino communities. So thank you for reinforcing the message. Sarah wants to go back to the point about participatory inclusion and seeing how the input will add value. And says, increasingly, our communities are resistant to extractive practices, essentially participation without compensation. And so curious if you've had to overcome that challenge, or how you would overcome that, or how you might approach it, and how, an administrator or a company or an organization who wants to engage in participatory futures can compensate the communities and the folks who are being included.
That is such a great question. So thank you so much for that, Sarah. Yes, so we actually compensated our participants for the data governance project. It was never even a doubt in our mind that, these young practitioners who are going to be carving out so much time, it is work that needs to be honored and respected, and therefore compensated as such. And wherever we felt that, if we felt that the budget was, I'm trying to answer in a very practical way, but wherever we felt that the budget could or may fall short, we actively worked directly with our participants to sort of understand what are the other ways in which this could create value for them. And I think that is really key because sometimes even as a speaker, I'm asked to, by traditional institutions to come and speak about this work. And there's already an assumption about what that exposure or, any of the things that they have on their list, they have an assumption about the fact that that would create value for me. And I think that's an extremely patronizing and condescending stance to take if you want to do this work. So wherever you feel that, wherever the project might be falling short, I think it's important to have an open dialogue and let whatever that looks like emerge from that dialogue. It has to come from the community. It cannot be something that we impose, because at the end of the day, whoever is participating needs to be felt adequately valued and compensated and celebrated and respected. So listen more, talk less is what I would say.
Yes, that's a great answer, and I think a good reminder to all of us, and especially when we are creating projects and building budgets that have budget for experts or budgets for high dollar speakers. Who else can be included in that category of people whose voices we want to hear, the experts of their own experience, and to engaging with them and compensating for that. So thank you. We're almost out of time. I wish we could keep going another hour. Thank you so much for sharing your beautiful philosophies and history and the way that you've approached really democratizing the field of foresight and bringing more and more people into it, and bringing the idea of how we can not empower people, but let their power be seen and be shown through inclusive storytelling. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone who has joined us from around the world today, and for all of your questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but hopefully you'll be able to join us again in the future. I'm going to give a little glimpse into what we have coming next. So again, thank you so much for coming today. We have another Foresight Talks webinar at the end of November with Future Matters, which is a future-oriented consultancy in China. So please stay tuned for more details on that. And again, as I mentioned, we have our Design Futures class coming up starting November 4th. There are still some seats left, and we have some discounts for nonprofits, academic groups, government folks, and alumni of our programs. So reach out if you want more information on that. I will be teaching, and excited to see any of you who want to join us for that. So I know we are at time. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. We will send a copy of this to those of you to everyone who registered, and please share, please spread the word. Please spread the word of Participatory Futures and Foresight, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.